Hi and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're painting the new Marneus Calgar. So he's a bit of a new chunky boy with his new armour that he's got, and we're going to be pretty much painting him as he is in the box art. A few little deviations because we can alter the base a little bit. So I've done sort of a sub-assembly where I've got the head, the base and the body separated. If you want to, you can also keep the cape separated on the back to make it easier to paint the behind of it. I struggled a little bit, I'd glued it in place. I think if I was doing this again I wouldn't glue the cape on and just keep the cape separate. And actually it turns out in a bit we could have just stuck the head in and painted it around, but I didn't know what I was going to do with the head area. Anyway, let's get started. So I've undercoated the model in Vallejo black primer, and now using Vallejo White Ink through the airbrush, we are doing a sort of zenithal highlight where I'm focusing the areas I want to be brightest. So short sharp burst on the airbrush and just cover those areas that we want to be brightest blue, leaving a gradient into black where we want it to be darker. So for me the sunlight's coming from his left arm downwards, so diagonally down. But of course this is a tabletop model, this is a display piece, so I want to try and get as much bright blue in the areas that I want to stand out, so his big power fists, his legs, on his back. So yeah, any areas that you want to be brighter, just put a bit more white there, and any areas that you want to be darker, just leave with a gradient going into the black. But always make sure you don't leave too much black, just a subtle bit of white there, just so it'd pick up some of the colour. You could also do the dry brush, the slap chop of this if you wanted to. Just progressively work up from a sort of dark grey to a light grey into white with a very subtle dry brush in white at the very end. Right, once that's done, we're now going to do just a little bit of panel lining. So just before this stage here, just get some Vallejo Mecha varnish, which is the gloss varnish, and spray that all over the miniature so that you sort of varnish in the miniature in a gloss varnish. Make sure it's a gloss varnish that you use. As I said, I use Vallejo Mecha varnish. Generally I would use some black panel liner, but I've run out, so I've got to make some. So with that, just some ivory black oil based paint, and then thin it down. I use the AK Odourless Thinner, but any odourless thinners, white spirits will do. Make sure they're odourless. If you use the sort of painter's white spirit, as in a decorator's, you'll gas yourself out. I actually thinned this down a little bit too much, so I had to apply one or two sort of coats. And what we're doing here, once that gloss varnish has dried, we're now just going to panel line the model, which is going around any of the recesses, any of the raised areas, sort of highlighting all of the edges where the recesses are. This picks out all of the detail and puts into shadow some of those darker areas. This is an optional step, but it does help define the shapes. The oil base, the reason for doing it like this over the gloss varnish is you get the capillary action. The oil based paint runs lovely into it. You can use water base, you could use Nuln oil or some watered down like a Baden black or Army War Painter's black, but the oil is a lot more intense in colour, flows a lot easier and takes minutes to dry. Really doesn't take a long time to dry. So just work yourself around the model, panel lining all of the details to make them stand out. Okay, as I mentioned, a few minutes to dry, 10-15 minutes maximum. You could use a hairdryer as well. And then back to the airbrush, and we're going to push through the airbrush, no diluting of this, some Citadel contrast Frostheart blue, It's a nice bright vibrant blue that covers the white really well. So just coat this all over the model. Doesn't matter about any overspray onto those black areas. We're going to paint over those again in a minute just to bring everything back to a neutral black colour. So very gently go over the model with this couple of coats. If you wanted to, it's an optional step that I don't do, you could use a darker blue like Talazar blue and spray that into the deep recesses so you get very, very dark in the recesses. But because we're doing some pink highlights a bit later on, sort of the glow from the Tyranid blood, I haven't done that, but you could do that if you wanted to. Of course, if you went the slap chop, then again just paint over your Frostheart blue all over the model. Okay, that's it with the airbrush for now. So I've got a wet palette. I'll use the Red Grass Everlasting wet palette. It's the small one, not the big one. I find it does exactly what I need. And I'll use the small hydration sheets. And now we're going to use some Army Painter's matte black. This is a size 0 brush. You could use a size 1 if you wanted, but I find a size 0 is good for detail and larger areas. And just add a little bit of water to the black, not too much, just a little paintbrush full. And now basically I'm just going to colour it in really. I'm going to colour in Calgar. Anything that's not blue armour, I'm going to paint black as black. This is an optional step. You could just start base coating your other colours straight over this, but I find what this does is, it's sort of a few reasons. It helps to unify all of the other areas. It makes you understand where all the details are on the model, and it helps define some shapes as well. You could use any colour for this. I'm using black. You could use a dark grey, dark browns, but I find black is a good unifying colour. So I won't bore you to death with this. But yeah, just keep working yourself around the model. So first what we're going to do is do the golds. There's quite a lot of gold on the model. So I'm using first a base coat of rusty gold, which is sort of Balthazar gold in the Citadel range. So just thin the paint a little bit and then just work around anything that you want to be gold. I was following the box art on this, so it's a lot of filigrees, a lot of emblems, trim around his head, a bit on both arms, his shoulder pads. There's on his leather straps there's little bits above the U of the Ultramarines. So yeah, it's quite a bit of gold, but just pick it all out in a dark gold colour. So for me I'm using AK Rusty Gold, but the Citadel range Balthazar Gold, more dark gold will be more good do. So once that's dry, grab some Reikland Flesh Shade, and I'm just going to use this just to define some of the shadows on some of those larger areas. So anywhere that's sort of big flat areas of gold, just applying some of this flesh shade. As you saw from the tutorial, I was almost dry brushing that shoulder pad there, so there's already some dark areas, but I think this Reikland Flesh Shade, it really brings out the warmth of the gold, defines some shapes, and we're going to go for a very bright gold finish, believe it or not. And to achieve that, to get real brightness, you need dark shadows. So we're going to darken down the shadows so that we can intensify the lightness. So very gently, with that size 0 brush, just add some of the Reikland Flesh Shade to your gold. Now here's an odd step for painting the gold. To get a bright gold, we're actually going to do, first of all, a layer of silver. So I'm using AK natural steel, but this would be Stormhold silver in the Citadel range. And just pretend now that you're painting gold and it's coming out silver. So this is our first layer of highlight. So anywhere that I want to be extra bright, I'm doing this as a base coat in the silver. So just work yourself around the model. So anywhere you want to be bright, paint it in this silver colour. This is an optional step. You don't have to do this. You could just paint your gold, your bright gold over the top. But I find this just really helps push the brightness that I was going for, and helps get some real good contrast from dark gold to light gold. I don't skip any bit on here, so you can follow along of where I've done the highlights, but anywhere that's pointing directly up to the light, pick out any interesting shapes that you want to pick out. It's an open canvas, you don't have to have it precise or lifelike. Anything you want to be nice and bright, just add this silver. You're probably covering 40-50% of the original base colour. Okay, with that done, grab some AK Old Gold, or this would be Retributor Armour if you're using Citadel paints, and now we're going to paint over the silver we've just painted. So go over the lines just a little bit, a millimetre either side, so you get a little blend from the dark to the bright gold, and then even brighter gold over the silver, so you're sort of overlapping it. You're getting a natural gradient then from dark to light to very light. You don't need much on the brush, so you're sort of, just over painting what you've just painted to really get that gold to pop. I was actually, in the grimdark way, kind of liking what we'd initially created there with gold, a very bright silver over the top. It was come out of quite a dirty gold look, quite a bleached gold, which I might use for future tutorials. But just for now, just paint over that silver you've done with this old gold or Retributor Armour. On some of the other items, the larger bits, you can add little scratches and marks with this, almost like you would do with armour. If you were painting, if you were highlighting and adding scratches, you can do that the same with gold, just to add some character and flavour to your texture to your model. Okay, and the final stage, annoyingly the wet palette is sort of out of the shot there, so I've made a little mix 50-50 of the old gold, which is your bright gold, and the bright silver. Make a 50-50 mix of that, and now I'm just doing little highlights where I want it to be brightest, so you get a nice bleached gold shine effect on those brighter areas. Just pick out any raised bits, the tops of the skulls, any edges, pick those out that you want to. Anything that you want to have caught the light a bit more and to stand out. So that's the gold done. To finish off the metallics, I'm just using gunmetal, which is from AK, lead belcher from Citadel, iron breaker from Citadel, iron warriors, good silvers as well. Any sort of dark. This gunmetal from AK gives a sort of bluish hint to it, but any silver will do. And just base coat the silvers here, nothing clever. Just base coat them in the silver, and then do a highlight in any bright silver that you want to. There's not much here, a bit on the barrels here, a little bit on the guns, a couple of pipes. There's not much silver. There's a chain there as well on the top, but just follow the box art for anything. Right, moving on to the leather. I'm going to base coat all the leather in AK Grim Brown. Citadel would be a sort of Rhinox hide, maybe even a Dryad bark. But Rhinox hide's a nice colour if you wanted to sort of replicate the Grim Brown. But yeah, just go over every piece of leather, which is there's his leather belt, the sword, and I think that's it. Leather on here, not too much, but it does sort of almost takes centre of the model, the leather, so we do want it to look nice, which is why I'm taking a few extra steps with the leather just to make it stand out. I'm deviating a little bit from the box art. The box art has a sort of reddish type leather, which you would achieve using sort of Mornfang browns and corn reds. I was going for a more worn, dirty looking leather than anything. So yeah, base coat it all in AK Grim Brown. And then we're going to move on to our next base colour, which is AK Leather Brown. So what I'm going to be doing here is pretty much covering all of the leather, leaving only a small bit of Grim Brown in the darkest recesses, around any of the little rivets that are there in any of the deep corners, just leaving it there, but basically picking out probably 95% of the leather with the leather brown. Now this is our first highlight, which is going to be Saddle Brown from AK. Now with this I do an edge highlight of all of the leather straps and start adding some scratches and marks to show that the leather has been worn. Final highlight is the Citadel Cadian flesh tone, And for this, it's a very thin edge highlight around all of the straps, and just a few more scratches and marks, picking out any sort of raised areas that you want to with your flesh tone. It adds a nice worn effect. You could go one higher than this and use like a flayed one flesh from Citadel or a vampiric flesh from AK, just to really pick out some detail, but he's relatively new in this armour, so I didn't want it to be that worn. Just make sure you do a nice edge highlight and a few little scratches and highlight those raised areas. And then with your bright gold, just pick out the little rivets that are on the leather straps. There's a few of them, about 3-4 on each one. Just pick those out, little bit on the brush, and then just hold your hand steady. I'm bracing my left hand there on the board and my right hand against the edge of the table, and just little dots. Okay, now we're going to paint the sort of ropes and trims. So I base coat these in AK violet red. Nothing clever here really, just anything that you want to be this sort of colour. This is your base coat, the violet red. Nicely out of focus there for you, but these are the 4 bits of rope around his chest. And any wax seals I also pick out in this colour. And also I pick out the hilt of his sword in this colour too. Okay, now we're going to move on to our first highlight. I'm using the AK Magenta. This would be sort of Screamer Pink in the Citadel. You would base coat really in sort of a corn red colour. So with the Magenta or Screamer Pink, just pick out the little bits of raised rope that have been modelled on the miniature, and then pick out on the sword handle just the raised parts in this colour. And then the final highlight will be with Intense Pink from AK, or that would be Pink Horror from the Citadel range. And with that you just add very, very subtle highlights, focusing mainly on the areas that are most raised, so the areas that are most pointing towards the light, have those of Intense Pink, and let the highlight get smaller the further you move away. So it looks like as it's closer to the light there's more highlight than there is further away. Very subtle but very effective. Right, with the wax seals done as well as the ropes, we're just going to paint the actual parchments now. We're just going to use two colours, but we're going to do a 50-50 blend of them. So we've got AK Mud Brown and AK Light Earth, and then I'll do a 50-50 mix of the two just to get that mid-tone. So just base coat all of the parchments in the Mud Brown. That would be Steel Legion Drab, and then Xandri Dust if you were using the Citadel paints, plus a 50-50 mix of the two. So base coat them all in Mud Brown, then do a small highlight in the 50-50 mix, picking out the raised areas, leaving that original Mud Brown in the deepest recesses, and then an edge highlight and raised area highlights using the pure AK Light Earth or Xandri Dust. You could then put maybe a Ushabti Bone or an ivory or pale sand colour over the top of those, but it was a bit too much, a bit too bright, and I wanted to keep the brightness for our glowing effects that we'll be doing. Use the same principles on the bit of parchment on his leg. Okay, now we're going to be painting the white areas, and for this we're starting off with a base coat of AK blue grey. It's a very, very bright pale grey with a hint of blue to it, and this gives us a nice framework for our shade paint that we're going to apply, and then allows us to highlight up from very bright to even brighter. So you could be fooled into just doing this white at first and then trying to highlight, but it's very hard to highlight white because it's already bright. So to start dark with white, you go for very bright greys. So there's quite a lot of this on the miniature. I use this to paint any of the U's, so that's around the leather straps, on his belt, on the little bit of his little badge, on by his armpit, the Ultramarine symbol in the iron halo, the Crux Terminatus as well on his leg and on his shoulder pad. So any of those, just paint in these colours. There's also a U on his right power fist that's quite tricky to get to, so just take your time with that one. But they're very raised, so they are easy to pick out. Okay, once they're all base coated, we're now just going to apply a shade. This will sort of tone it down a little bit and add some life to the recesses. So we're using the Citadel shade, Drakenhof Night shade, and then just add in one big drop of water to it. It's pretty much a 50-50 mix because this is a very intense colour. If you haven't got this, you could just use Nuln Oil, but this just gives it a slight blueness that you can see that's quite favourable. You could also use the Apothecary White, I think it is, from the contrast range to do that, but Drakenhof Nightshade really helps give that instant shade that we're looking for. You could apply a couple of layers of this. If you water it down too much, don't be scared to water it down a bit too much. You can always apply another layer over the top. So just like any shade, just careful applying it, because it doesn't go anywhere. But just apply this over all the areas you've just painted white, and any that you want darker, just apply a second coat. Once your shade is dry, we're now going to move on to our first highlight, and I'm using Vallejo Silver Grey. This would be Orthan Grey in the Citadel range. So just any areas now you want to be white. I have to thin this down a little bit, it's quite a thick paint straight out of the pot. So I'm highlighting probably 80% of all of this bright white stuff that we're painting here. All your edges, any raised areas, just pick these out in your Orthan Grey or Silver Grey, whichever colour you're using here. And then once that's dry, we then do our highlight using white. We don't use a lot, little dots here and there, but it really helps make it look bright white. So we've gone from a bright colour to an even brighter colour, and you can use those same principles if you're painting any sort of white. If you're not using an airbrush and you've got to paint it on, you can use these principles. Airbrush, you'd use slightly different colours, but same principles. Always start from a darkish grey up through to a bright white. Okay, we're now moving on to the cloak, and I was sent some of these new War Painters paints in the red triad, and I wasn't sure if I was going to use all 6, but I knew I was going to use these 3, which is Resplendent Red, Legendary Red, and one other that I can't quite remember the name of. So we've got Legendary Red, I'm just looking at them now, Resplendent Red, and Angelic Red. Usually I've got my own reds that I would use from AK, even the Citadel ones, but I thought I'd give these a go. So we start off with our darkest red. I wanted quite a flat. We're going to be doing some transfers and freehands on our cape, on the cloak, so I didn't want to go too nuts with the highlighting of this. I wanted it quite flat, almost velvety looking as well, with some effects we're doing in a minute. But I'm using Resplendent Red here as our base coat, which would be Mephiston Red if you're using the Citadel colours, or I guess it would be a dark red, maybe a deep red from the AK range. Coverage is okay. That was 2 coats that I used there over the black. If you wanted a bright red, I'd go over white. I would just paint these pure white. If you were looking for a very, very bright red finish, then yeah, base coat in white or a cream, and then go over with these reds. It's probably got better coverage. So once the base coat is dry, a couple of coats you'll need. I've then moved on to the next red, which I think was the Angelic Red, which would be your Evil Sun Scarlets, which would be blood red in the AK range. And this is the good thing about these triad colours, is they're very close to each other, so you don't have to technically worry about blending them in. The gradients are so different, aren't that different between each one. I've hardly noticeable. The light is quite bright. I've got to tone that down a little bit, but it's very hard to see when you're painting the miniature. You can see the differences, but it's not a huge drop or increase in brightness that looks a bit garish, so you can just paint these straight on. So what I'm doing here is I'm just picking out all the raised areas and edge highlighting in this middle colour. Again, a couple of coats. I did sort of 1 or 2, just depending on how raised it was. So the more raised, the more closer I did. That's where I did a couple of coats, just making sure you're picking out your edges with these. And then we're going to be using legendary red. This is our final red highlight. And I pick out again all of the raised areas, any of the sort of big edges like those ones, the creases, and then any raised areas, any ones that you want to be brighter. This is going to be our brightest red before we move on to our edge highlight. Just pick those out. This would be a sort of Wazdaka red, I think, in the Citadel range. But yeah, just very gently pick out those edges and creases. You can see the colour difference there, but when it dries back you can hardly notice the difference in the blending of it. And then we're just going to use the vermilion colour. It's got an outrageous name. And this would be Cadian Flesh Tone, I think would be the equivalent. That's the general colour I'd use from Citadel to highlight the red. And I'm using that vermilion colour to edge highlight all of the big raised creases and edges, and just add some little scratches and marks on the actual cloak itself, just to give it a little bit of life, so it doesn't look so flat. Yeah, Violent Vermilion is what it's called. An amazing paint name, and a good cover. So you know, these paints, these new ones, amazing coverage, especially if you're going to do it over white. It doesn't coat that well over black. You need a few, but for vibrancy, you should generally try and go over white anyway. So yeah, if you're looking for just a different, I mean the Army Painters War Paints, the Fanatic range, are really good. Great colours. They remind me a lot of the AK colours. Easy to apply, great coverage. They water down well, they cover well, they go through the airbrush well. So yeah, great all-round paints, great colour ranges, and you can buy the sets of 6. So you can get the reds, the greens, the blues, purples, pinks, all sorts. Relatively cheap. I think they're about £25 for the sets, and yeah, they'll last you a very long time. And yeah, they give you just a different outlook, different outcomes to your models, especially if you play about with your base colours, your blacks or your greys or your whites, to get different looks and feels. Okay, once all of that is dry, I'm now going to apply some matte varnish to the cloak. Two reasons. First reason, to protect it and unify all of the colours. Second reason is I'm going to apply some transfers. And sometimes by putting a bit too much water on when you're applying transfers, or the microset stuff that we're going to use can pull the paint off. So I always get a bit nervous, so I always apply a matte varnish. I'm using the AK Ultra Matte varnish, but you could use normal matte varnish or Lamium medium. Hard coat I would move away from because it's shiny. We're going for a matte finish here, which also helps give the cloak a velvety type feel, because it adds a little bit of texture to it. You could add a gloss varnish if you want to, because it does help stick the transfers down a bit better, but I generally don't have any problems using these matte varnishes. And it takes about 10-15 minutes to dry. I'm in the middle of an office move and I couldn't find my little paint pot palette that I've got, so I'm using the top of a glue bottle. So needs must when you can't find stuffs. Then what I do, once that's dry, I'm then going to apply a couple of transfers. I got these from an Ultramarine set that I've got, so I've got the sort of Ultramarine symbol and then the Ultramar wording underneath it. Applied them normally with the water, then applied that microsol stuff over the top, which helps bend the transfers to the shapes that you want. And using that plus another layer of ultramatte varnish gives the effect that makes it look like you've actually painted that stuff on. So it gives a sort of freehand look and it looks really good. So once all of that's dry, this stage is optional, but I think you're going to find it's quite easy to do. We're going to do a little bit of freehand because the cape looked a bit boring, and for this I'm just going to want to do a little gold outline around the bottom and sides of the cloak. So I'm a couple of millimetres up, a couple of millimetres in, and so just to make sure I keep with those, I've done my first line and then I just put little dots. So I'm going to be doing join the dots. So I'm applying dots in any areas where there's a crease or a raised area, so that then I can draw my line to those dots to maintain the distancing that I want to do. So for this I'm using rusty gold, so you'd use like Balthazar gold. So similar, what we do is we're going to apply this first as our base coat, and then apply a brighter gold as a highlight in any areas we want to be a bit brighter. So I'm just doing straight lines and going to map out the edge of the cloak or cape. I then do little squares, rectangles in the corners, and then a couple of little twisty filigree bits on the top and bottom. But just start by doing, if you want to do a little bit of freehand, just start by doing simple straight lines around the model, around the edges. Really easy to do. Just a steady hand, a little bit of thin down paint, don't have it too thick, and you'll be surprised what you can do with a little bit of practice. If it goes wrong, it's paint. You know, this red cloak is quite basic. You just paint over it again and start again. Obviously we've done the transfers there, but you can still practice this on a sort of any large area that you've got. But yeah, doing the little dots to make sure you keep your distancing correct is a nice little tip. I learned the tip a few years ago doing that, that you can make sure, just put dots and you just do, then the large piece of freehand becomes a very small piece of freehand because you're doing it in very small stages. Now I'm just doing that old gold over any areas that I want to be brighter, and then once it's all done and you're happy with it, I apply another layer of varnish just to tone down the gold, blend it all together and give that velvety, worn feel that we're getting from his cloak. Okay, it's now time to paint his noggin. So quite a straightforward way I'm doing here, nothing too fancy. We're starting with a base coat of Kislev flesh from the Citadel range. So paint the whole of his face with the Kislev flesh, a couple of coats if you've watered it down. He's got a bit of hair and he's got a big old Locutus of Borg eye on one side. So yeah, just paint all of his face in this colour. As that's drying, I then just base coat back any of the areas you've gone over just in the black, just to bring them all back, because you can be quite carefree with that Kislev flesh, because you know you can just go over it again just to bring those areas back. And once that black is dry, I base coat his hair in the sky blue, that sort of bright greyish blue colour. And then on his face we do a flesh wash of Reikland Flesh Shade all over his face. and we also do a little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade on his hair. Right, once the flesh shade has dried, I then make another shade wash using AK Wine Red. You could use Carroburg Crimson for this, but heavily watered down. That wine red is 10 to 1, 10 water, 1 drop of paint. Carroburg Crimson would be similar, many drops of water to 1 drop of paint. And just apply this wash over the entire face. The reason I'm doing this is the Reikland flesh shade adds a nice flesh tone to it, but I wanted to add a little bit more life to him. So just this red, just to gives a bit more character in the cheeks, around the eyes and the nose. Optional step, but it helps push your painting to the next level by applying a multiple couple of washes over the top. I've also base coated the little flames on his back, on his arm there, in white. I did that whilst it was drying off. So now we're just going to go back to highlighting. So we're just going to reapply some Kislev flesh, just to bring that back to a flat area. So his cheeks, jawline, raised areas around the mouth, his nose, bits of his forehead, just bring those back. So painting faces can be quite tricky, quite hard. It's quite tricky to bring up on the camera, but I hope you can see I'm just picking out the raised areas, leaving the deepest recesses in our flesh washes that we did. And then once this is dry, I then use the Citadel Flayed One flesh, and I pick out his nose, his eyebrows, his big old chin, and a little bit of his cheeks and forehead. Just very subtle, not too much, just highlight those extreme raised areas, especially like the top of his cheek. And if you can, a little bit of white to map out his teeth that's in his mouth. And that's his head pretty much done. It was quite a simple way of doing the face, but those 3 colours that we're sort of using, the Kislev flesh, a flesh wash, Flayed One flesh, gives a nice finish to your faces. Okay, now we're going to be moving on to painting sort of glowing areas, the little gems and diamonds and lights on the model. So any lenses on his head there, paint the entire lens in the wine red. So that's the lens itself plus the surrounding area. The same with these gems, paint the gem itself and that little bit of surrounding area. The little diamonds, just paint those in the wine red. And also his backpack, his exhaust from his backpack, paint all of that in wine red as well. There's a few gems around, but this base coat of what we're to be doing here is creating both a glowing red effect and a sort of cold red effect as well. So this wine red is the glow is the coldest part of it. So imagine a bright red torch shining, or a fire, the glow from it, the darkest part we would have is this wine red colour, and your highlights getting brighter. So if it's cold, it's dark. If it's bright, it's warm. So that's what we're going to be creating here, and we're using this in various different ways across various different parts to create similar outcomes. So the exhaust vent, the red is the afterglow. On the lens, the wine red is the afterglow. There's also tiny little lights in each side of his neck area. So pick all of those out and some of the surrounding area as well. So imagine that the dot you're doing here is the light, and then brush it out as if that's how the light is coming out. So first highlight we're going to do is using AK Blood Red, which would be Evil Sun Scarlet. You can see that I've just painted the wine red on his exhausts. So what we're doing here is we're going to be picking out the bits that are creating the heat or the glow. So we're actually going to pick out the lens and the gems and the diamonds, leaving that wine red in those deepest recesses. The lights either side, we're picking out the little modelled light, this little bit of dot there, each one, and then coming out with the blood red so it covers about 60-70% of the wine red that you put in place. So we're basically painting over the wine red with the blood red when we're doing those lights, and for the gems we're leaving the wine red on that very outer part and painting the gem itself with the blood red. And on his exhaust vents on the back, we're just painting the central areas in the blood red, as if the glow, the heat, is coming from the central parts of those vents, deep within himself. So as you can see, the same colours but used to create different effects. Okay, now we're moving on to get a highlight. So to get our fluorescent colours working, we have to start from a base of white. So I'm using AK Pure Intense White. What I'm doing here is I'm actually mixing. I'll be using some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. In the bottom of each of those bottles is a little ball bearing, and you need to mix up. This is a new bottle, so there's a lot of pigment stuck at the bottom, so I had to unpick it with a needle and then give the bottle a good shake, and I didn't realise I was recording all this. So yeah, the Fluor paints need a really good shake. So sometimes when they're new or you haven't used them for a while, you have to take the little lid off. I use an old airbrush needle and I stick that inside and give it a good mix up, but it just shows you, yeah, paints need very good shaking, especially the fluorescent paints. So like I was saying, in order to get fluorescent paints to work well, you need to have a very bright base coat, so we go to white. So this stage what we're doing is we're going to be creating the base coat of our intense heat or glowing that we want to do. So, in a step that I failed to record, I'm just noticing, what I went and done was highlighted the areas that I want to be brightest in white. So I used AK Pure White, Intense White, you could use Skull White, any of the white is good. So on the gems, little dots of white to pick them out. On the lights on his each side and on his lens, again little dots of white. This is where we want the light to be emanating from, is the little dot of white. So on the gems, little dots in the centres, all the top corners, dots where in the centre of the lens is. As you can see, I'm painting it, but just coming out ever so slightly, so that the red, the fluorescent red from Green Stuff World, goes over the base coats that we've just done, but covers the white itself. And on the vent on his exhaust, you can see I've done little dots of white in the middles there. Let's see as I arch it back. You can see where I've done the white, little lines in the very, very centre where I wanted the heat to be the most. But just cover the vents in the fluorescent red from Green Stuff World. You can use fluorescent red from AK as well, but the Green Stuff World just covers, or they cover a little bit like contrast paints. And then we move on to our final highlight, which I'm going to be using AK Fluorescent Orange. And for this, we're just going to be only painting it over the white dot that we originally did. So we've already covered it with a red, but we went over that and the surrounding areas. Now we're only going to be painting the little white dot in the orange to really show that that's where the intense glow is coming from. I then just paint the little flame in the fluorescent orange, the whole flame in fluorescent orange, and then use the fluorescent red and just blend it into the top, so that you go from bright orange to sort of bright red on the flame on his side. If you weren't using fluorescent paints, then you would use a bright yellow. Apply the bright yellow, but then quickly apply like an Evil Sun Scarlet over the top to get a natural sort of wet blend from yellow through to red. So yeah, we've achieved quite a lot. I wanted just to intensify some of that white, so I'm just applying a couple more highlights to the white areas. I really wanted to bring those out. Where the white had dried, it had gone a little bit flat, so I'm just using that now just to bring out on the sort of on the filigrees of the U's of the Ultramarine symbol, just to brighten those up a little bit. Sometimes you can apply highlights and think they're nice and bright, but then you sort of are fluorescence. Sometimes your glowing effects, you want to be some of the brightest parts of the model, so you can keep your highlighting minimal, then have your bright points, and then just make sure your other highlights aren't too bright. Okay, so I've stuck Marneus to his base, and because of the 500 worlds that's going on at the moment, the new narrative that Warhammer have just started, with the 500 worlds trying to be taken over, a lot of Tyranid activity, so I stuck into his base as normal, but I used the new skull boxes from Games Workshop and just stuck a bunch of Tyranid stuff over the top, so just to give it a bit of character. So this stage is optional, but if you want to do it, this is how you do it to get that nice glowing pink blood effect. In that pot on the right hand side is a little mix of 1 part Vallejo White Ink, to about 2 parts water and 1 part contrast medium. In recent weeks I've started to put about it's 2 drops of ink, 2 drops of water, 2 drops of medium, so it's an even mix, and what you create there is a nice white ink contrast paint that flows nicely into deep recesses, leaves it really bright, sometimes takes away from the need of doing the airbrush. I don't airbrush this through to get a gradient effect. So what I'm doing here is I'm applying this, so where I want the blood to be its brightest, I apply it thicker, so almost like washing it over, and the paint will naturally, like we had earlier with the panel lining, the capillary action of this will thicken the white up in the deepest recesses where it will glow, leave a sort of gradient effect of the white. So these skulls come with all cuts and grooves all in them, so it's quite easy to find where you want to do. As you see, I'm not even holding it where you can see, but I think you get the point of what I'm doing here. This is the base coat of our fluorescent paints. This takes a good 15 to 20 minutes to dry, so leave this maximum half an hour. Then through the airbrush, I'm going to be using some AK fluorescent magenta. Nothing clever here, straight through the airbrush, cover all of the whites that you've just painted on, and have some go over the surrounding areas so that you'll get a natural sort of gradient from dark fluorescent magenta to very bright fluorescent magenta. Don't worry if you get overspray on the model on those areas, that's what we want. So where you want to have the glow bouncing back off of the armour, apply some of this magenta directly to it, and we'll be adding some highlights to that to really sell the object source lighting, the bounce glows that we're going to be getting. So as you can see, I'm applying it quite liberally over all of that white and letting it spray in directional sprays of where it's going to hit his armour. Yeah, don't be scared of that. Obviously don't go crazy, don't spray it into areas that wouldn't catch the light, only spray it on areas that would naturally catch those bounce reflections. Okay, again, I'd leave that a couple of seconds. I'm flicking through the lights there so that you can see where I've got that overspray working. Now back to the white ink wash, and I wanted to really make that pink pop. So first off, any areas that you want to have sort of the blood coming from, so where the blood is going to be its most pink, just apply some of this white into those areas, and then give it a good 10-15 minutes to dry, because we're going to apply another type of paint over the top of this. It's optional this stage, but it's worth doing it. The next paint we use is optional to what you want to use, but in order to achieve a more glow, just apply a bit more of this white and then give it 10-15 minutes to dry. But I'm going to be moving, this is real time we're doing this, so I'll be moving to another little bit that we'll be painting whilst I'm waiting for this to dry. Okay, whilst we're waiting for it to dry, we're now going to apply just some highlights to our bounce reflections that we already did. So I'm using AK Magenta, white, and then fluorescent magenta there. So what I actually do with the magenta is I create a little glaze of it, so drag some out and then a little brush full of water just to make a sort of 50-50 glaze. So it's one little drop of paint to one drop of water. I'm just going to apply this over those areas that we've already caught with the airbrush with the fluorescent, and this just intensifies that. So as you saw there, I covered probably 90% of that part of the armour, but I've only applied the glaze to maybe 50% of it. And then once that glaze is dry, then apply another to 30% of it, and then 20% and 10%. So what you're doing is by glazes you're getting more and more bright colour further and further down, so you're creating natural gradients from it. I also paint some of this just on the gold, the bottom of his sword there. As we know, metals reflect light a lot better than flat matte areas, so just applying it there gives a little bit of I use this lightly, a little bit of realism to what we're doing, as it would catch that metal there down the bottom. I also wanted to keep this glow subtle but really make it hit hard. You could find that if you do too much of it, it doesn't really work, and too little of it, you don't notice it. So we're in the middle ground here of him crushing Tyranids and walking through the blood. Now, much like we did before, I'm using the white as the base coat of the fluorescent. So all I'm doing here is just adding little, almost edge highlighting small areas that I want to be the brightest reflection. So the bottom of his armour, the bits closest to where that blood is pooling. Not too much, little line highlights here and there. And then using our fluorescent magenta, we apply it almost quite thick, like a contrast paint, over the white and a little bit over the surrounding areas, so we get a nice little blend of the magenta to fluorescent magenta. And you can see that really helps sell that the reflections, the glow is reflecting back off of that armour, intensifying off the gold and on the bottom parts. Okay, this next stage is optional, what paints you want to use. You could just use the magenta, fluorescent magenta, or you can use the AK Wargame Enamel Liquid Pigment Pink Fluor. So this is an oil-based paint, enamel-based paint, fluorescent pink. It's very, very bright. It does offer a subtle difference between the two, as you can see there from the pot. So if you weren't doing this, you would just paint your magenta that you've just used over the white that we previously did. But I'm using the oil-based paint as this has a bit more of an intense glow to it than our AK fluorescent pink. You can already see there the difference that you get. It's insane. It actually whites out the camera where it's so bright. But just with an old brush, just carefully apply this just over the white that you've just done, so that you get a really, really intense pink glow from the Tyranid blood. And it takes probably half an hour to an hour to dry, not too long. You can use an hairdryer to dry it a bit quicker if you want to. The actual base itself was, I used, I've got some sand and stone that I've got in a big tub, and just used some super glue to glue that down with the Tyranid bits, and then just dry brushed the Tyranids in a purplish colour, and I used grim brown, mud brown and light earth to the dry brushing of the actual base itself. Very muted earthy tones. Again, I really wanted the fluorescence to pop, so I didn't want a very bright base. I wanted the blood and gore to be bright, so the actual earth itself is very muted. And then the gamer grasses, obviously I airbrushed those and I base coated it, and you just dry brush those as well when you're doing your base to give a nice unified feel to it. Then I just washed the brush out with the AK Odourless Thinners. So I actually have two pots of Odourless Thinners. I have one that I use for cleaning my brush, and one that I use for thinning any oil-based paints. Keep the two separated. Right, final stage, we are going to edge highlight and add battle damage now to the blue armour. So for this I use AK Sky Blue, which is like blue horror from the Citadel range. And in its basic principle, what I'm doing here is edge highlighting the blue armour, but I'm also adding little scratches, dents, bullet holes of where I wanted some damage. Not too much, one, because there's not much armour showing actually for a model, and two, it's new armour, so I didn't want it too heavily beaten up because he's only just got in it. So yeah, like I was saying, principles are you just do your edge highlighting, but because I've got a little bit of a shaky hand and I like to add a little bit of character and texture to the armour, I add this battle damage, and it's a straightforward thing of just a slightly thicker line where you want to be damaged, little straight lines for scratches, sort of star shapes for bullet holes. I don't, this part of the video, there's no editing here, you're going to watch me do the whole thing. It's tedious, but by watching it you'll get an idea. I've got other videos that you can watch, especially I think there's a Dark Angels Redemptor one, and a couple of tanks where you can see me do this battle damage over a huge expansive model to get an idea of how we do it. But yeah, principles, edge highlighting with a light blue colour. And once that's done, I use Army Painter's Matte Black, but you could use Abaddon Black, Corvus Black, you could even use Rhinox Hide if you wanted to. And any areas that you want to have the damage in, you now infill those with the black. So leave the sky blue, the sky blue as your highlight around, but just fill in the area that you want to be the dent or the scratch with the black. Making sure that if you do a scratch, that you go above the scratch with the black, not below it. You fill in your little bullet holes. If you're doing edge highlighting, then you just do little edge highlight it with the black, but little dots, not a full straight line. Comes with practice. Terminator models are really good to practice this on, as well as big tanks, because you get huge areas to do it on. I wouldn't say less is more, sometimes more is more, especially on tanks. If you do bigger areas, you can do black and then with a little bit of brown, just to show the rustness coming through. But for Marneus and his new armour, I didn't want to do too much. I didn't want to take away from the gory Tyrannid and the glowing effects that we've created. So yeah, this step is optional, but adds a little bit of character to your characters. Once you're done, I then used just a standard Army Painter's Matte Black to do the base rim. And there he is. That's the final stage. Marneus Calgar all done. So we've done quite a lot of techniques used here, a lot of easy to do steps to give great effects. Of course, we've used the airbrush. It's not an expensive airbrush, it's one from Fender that only costs £30. My actual my airbrush kit is less than £100 for the whole thing. So yeah, I hope you've liked this tutorial. We've got loads on the channel. Like and subscribe. There's at least 2 or 3 videos a week that I try and push out. So yeah, as always, happy painting.